Hi everyone, it's Margot here, and today I'm taking you to Hever Castle. Some of you have seen my videos on this channel throughout the years, and I've recently started my own channel, Crown and Kingdom, which you can find linked above and in the description below. Once you've watched this video, come on over and see what else I've got on offer. I'd love to see you there. Until then, enjoy this virtual tour. Just 30 miles outside of London, tucked in the countryside of beautiful Kent, sits the 13th century Hever Castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn. The scene of the courtship between Henry VIII and his second wife, Hever Castle was the background of the marriage that would change the course of English history, and still contains within it a number of items that once belonged both to Henry and Anne. Later owned by Henry VIII's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, after the downfall of the Boleyn family, today the castle is open to the public, and I'm ready to share it with you. So let's go. Although most closely associated with Anne Boleyn, Hever Castle existed long before she was born, and still stands centuries after her death. Begun in the 13th century, the castle came into the hands of the Boleyn family in 1462, when it was converted from a fortification into the grand manor that we see today. However, by the late 19th century, most of the structure was in ruins, having been passed down through a series of private owners. In 1903, the property was purchased by the American magnate William Waldorf Astor, who completed a total restoration of the building, as well as adding the Italian gardens, which we will explore later, and the mock Tudor village behind the castle that you can see here. Today, these buildings are known as the Astor Wing, and they run as holiday cottages and bed and breakfasts, which means you can, indeed, spend the night right here. These days, the castle is the property of the Guthrie family, who maintain the building and operate the daily running of the site as a popular tourist attraction. Today, we are going to start our tour by coming into the castle via the main entrance gate, as visitors, including King Henry VIII, and residents such as Anne Boleyn herself, would have done for centuries. The gatehouse is the oldest part of the castle today, having been constructed in 1270. Originally, it was built with defensive purposes in mind, both the moat and the drawbridge being two impediments to castle attack. The drawbridge we're walking over now, however, is not the original, and was reinstated by William Waldorf Astor. This portcullis, however, is a different story, and is said to be one of the oldest working portcullises in the country. It is one of three that would have been placed between these gatehouse arches during the castle's heyday as a fortification. As we continue into the courtyard, you can immediately see the classic Tudor timbered framed additions to the castle added by the Boleyn family. Although some of what you see is original, restoration and renovations were carried out here both in the year 2000 and in 2016, when some of the wooden beams were replaced with green oak, sourced locally on the castle estate. In the time of Anne Boleyn, there would have been 4 entrances into the courtyard, but today there are just 2. There's a fantastic Victorian print showing Henry VIII entering the courtyard through one of them. Here is the gatehouse we have just walked through, and the other is directly opposite where we will go through now, just below these windows. Upon entering the building today, guests are sent to the right toward the inner hall, where one of the first images seen is that of William Waldorf Astor, the man largely responsible for the renovation and restoration of what we will see today. And just next to his portrait is the entrance to his drawing room. In the time of the Boleyn family, this room would have held the larder and dairy, but Astor had it turned into a space for lavish entertainments. Here, his guests would be served drinks before their dinner parties. The Astors entertained celebrities, politicians, and members of the royal family, many of whom signed guest books located in the castle, and whose signatures can be seen today, including those on this table. The center name on the list there is Elizabeth Lyon, better known as Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the late Queen Mother, grandmother to our current King Charles III. Elsewhere in the room is the framed signature of another notable guest, Sir Winston Churchill. Although Astor sought to modernize parts of the castle, he instructed that the craftsmen and workers who helped him maintain the building used the same tools, materials, and techniques that the workmen in Tudor times would have used. This means that although the beautiful wooden paneling that you see is just over a century old, they are as close to 16th century originals as possible. The plaster ceiling is based on an Elizabethan design with beautiful details. In fact, the entire room is filled with detail, and my favorite is probably the charming little goldfish hidden inside this vase. As you take one last look at the view of the drawing room, it's worth mentioning that with the exception of one, all of the wooden panels in this room are unique, but finding the duplicate is a very hard task indeed. The drawing room also conceals two secrets. Firstly, and I'll freeze here, is the panel just to the right of this plant, on the left-hand side, which conceals an entrance to an original medieval turret. Not in need of access to it, Astor had it turned into a drinks cabinet. And the second is the record player to the right of the sofa here, which has been converted from a satinwood George III toilet. Leaving the drawing room behind takes us into the inner hall, whose sumptuous appearance obscures the original usage of this room as the Tudor Great Kitchen. Decorated today with works of art, originally this entire side of the room would have been taken up by a huge fireplace for cooking. As you look at the windows, you can clearly see the thick stone walls that make up the oldest part of the castle. The ceiling was made high to handle the immense heat from the huge fireplace. The fireplace today is a replacement, the Tudor versions having eventually collapsed under their weight of the Tudor chimneys in the 1880s. All the paneling you see is sumptuous Italian walnut, and from this vantage point we get a spectacular view of the gallery above, which was added to the building around 1905. Carved by W.S. Frith, it was inspired by the rood screen in King's College Chapel, Cambridge, which itself was installed at the request of Henry VIII in 1532 to celebrate his upcoming marriage to Anne Boleyn. It's quite fitting, then, for it to feature so prominently in her childhood home. All the furniture you can see is antique, dating mostly from the 17th and 18th centuries. But right here is something I find particularly charming. Perched just above the fireplace sits a silver gilt clock that is said to be an exact replica of the clock given to Anne Boleyn by King Henry VIII on the morning of their wedding. It is topped by a leopard holding a shield bearing the royal coat of arms. The bell of the clock is hidden behind the scrollwork in the dome. The original is now in possession of the Royal Collection Trust. The odd table in the center of the room is a Spanish warming table based on a 16th century design. We do know that there was one here when the Boleyns owned the castle, and it's thought that it was used in the courtyard to keep food warm during outdoors dining. And speaking of dining, if I pause here and you look very closely at the wooden paneling on the right, you will notice two ironwork hinges. That's because these panels are actually hidden doors that would have originally given the kitchen staff access to the Boleyn's dining hall, which, incidentally, is where we are headed next. Many of the timbers in this hallway are original to the Tudor times, including this beautiful arch. Now, as opposed to what we've seen so far today, this room looks more similar to how it would have in the time of Anne Boleyn. This is the Great Hall, where the Boleyns, Anne of Cleves, and later the Astors would have held formal dinners. Originally, the ceiling was open to the roof rafters, but in 1506 Thomas Boleyn added the gallery above, along with a wooden paneling similar to this. Previously, the room would have been warmed by an open hearth in the center, necessitating high ceilings. But the advent and installation of side fireplaces put those needs to rest. The table is set in a modern style, as though the Astors are ready to dine here, but the table is overlooked by original features, such as this incredible fireplace. The surrounds of the fireplace are not original. And you can see the original version here on the left in a painting from the 19th century, which shows the dining hall being decorated for Christmas. Today, it is topped by a shield bearing the Boleyn coat of arms, as well as intricate detailing carved into clipsome stone sourced in Rutland. The wooden table dates from the 16th century, but on the day I visited was sadly covered by a tablecloth. The tapestry here is from a series entitled Months and Seasons, and it represents August. It was woven in Brussels in 1540 and would have cost an incredible amount of money, much like the ones in the Tudor dining hall seen in my Hampton Court Palace video. Although this tapestry was bought by Astor, it is highly likely that a similar one would have been here during the time that Henry VIII dined in this hall. There are 24 walnut armchairs in the hall, in a mid-17th century style, although they were reupholstered in 2000. The arms are original, and I love the lion details. Castle dining halls were always meant to impress and display the wealth of the owner. The tapestries certainly serve this purpose. The portraits on the wall depicting King Henry V and the Black Prince are intended to do the same. In between them is a collection of Victorian glass bottles on a 17th century buffet, mimicking the medieval habit of displaying expensive plate in the hall. And on that subject, do you see the 2 rectangular spaces carved into the castle's walls there? These original Tudor features are known as ombres, and were used by the Boleyns to show off their plate. And it is hard to see without getting right next to it, but the red hue on the stone shows where some of the original vibrant Tudor paint is still visible to this day. Note that, in the time of the Boleyns, this room would have doubled as staff quarters, where the servants would bed down at night. Just a little bit nicer than a Holiday Inn Express. Overlooking it all today is the Minstrels Gallery, carved by Nathaniel Hitch at the request of William Waldorf Astor. The original purpose of a minstrels gallery was to create a discreet location for musicians to serenade the guests dining below, so it is fitting that this one rests entirely upon the backs of small carved musicians, like this Tudor woman here. It's probably worth noting that women were not performing as paid musicians at the Tudor court, but Queen Elizabeth I's ladies-in-waiting were known to have proficiency in a number of instruments, so it's not a wildly inaccurate carving. But my favorite thing about this room isn't to be found above us, but rather right beside us, over here. This ornately designed lock is thought to have actually belonged to Henry VIII. Henry was highly concerned with his own personal safety and had a deep fear of assassination. Ahead of a visit to any house in the land, Henry would send a personal locksmith to fit a specialty lock to his bedchamber door, and only his most trusted aide would hold the key. The keyhole is hidden just here. It is believed that the one at Hever Castle was left behind by mistake. I find it absolutely charming. The other door in the hall contains a replica lock made at the orders of Astor to match the original. The light at this angle clearly shows Henry's coat of arms, bearing the 3 lions and fleur-de-lis, as well as 2 Tudor roses below it. From the dining hall, we pass under the ornately carved doorway into the entrance hall, featuring original wooden timbers dating from the late 15th century. Firstly, on the right-hand side is a portrait of King Henry VII, which is hard to get a good view of with the lighting. Below, there are a few pieces of furniture and some cushions that I am desperate to have in my own home. Would you put these on your couch? I would. The large wooden piece here is a choir stall dating from 1480, which was made in Italy from walnut wood and acquired by Astor specifically for this room. Also within the hall are 2 interesting items. Firstly is a caquetoir, or a conversation chair. This one dates from the 16th century and features a wide trapezoidal-shaped seat to accommodate the wide dresses worn by women during that period. And secondly is a pair of boots known as postilion's boots. A postillion was a man who rode one of a pair of coach-pulling horses. A rider was at serious risk of damage to his leg if the two horses should bump into one another, so each postillion would wear one of these large jack-boots on the side closest to the second horse. The pair of boots at Hever Castle are made of leather and iron and date from around 1690. Past a portrait of another Henry, the fourth this time, takes us into the library. In Tudor times, this was most likely an estate office, and William Astor made a modernized version by turning this into his library. Originally, there were 2,500 books kept here, all bound in calf and Moroccan leather, then gilt-tooled with his family coat of arms. The bookcases they were kept on were inspired by those used by diarist Samuel Pepys, who you may be familiar with from my Great Fire of London video. The ceiling is a recreation of those used at Hampton Court Palace, which you also might remember from another of my videos. In the time of Anne Boleyn, there was a staircase in this room that would have led up to the family's private apartments, but it is no longer here today. Above the fireplace, a lovely portrait of John Jacob Astor, great-grandfather to William Waldorf Astor and founder of the family's fortune. You can just see the moat through the window here, and a bust of Christopher Columbus, which overlooks the space. You can see here just how busy it was on the day I visited. From here, we're going to make our way into the morning room. There's a lovely bit of decoration above the door there. Now, we are entering what was once a retiring room in Tudor times, which today features an exhibition about Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, including mannequin figures of them both. This is Catherine of Aragon, although I have reservations about the accuracy of her likeness. Originally wed to Henry VIII's older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, who died 5 months after their wedding, Catherine of Aragon would be the first of Henry's eponymous 6 wives. Wed in 1509, Catherine and Henry's marriage was initially a happy one, but it would end in disaster. The primary cause of their marital strife was linked to the couple's desire to produce a son. Although Catherine would give birth at least 6 times, only one of her children survived, the Princess Mary. As the son of a man whom many saw as a usurper, Henry was determined to secure his succession with a male heir to the throne. His desperation for a son would lead him away from his marriage, towards a break with the Catholic Church, and into the arms of Anne Boleyn. The nuances behind the slow dissolution, both metaphorically and legally, of Henry's first marriage, and the tumultuous 3 years of his second, is a topic for another day, however. The display in this room focuses on the similarities and differences between Catherine and her successor, with the title Queens, Rivals, Mothers. It highlights the differences of their origins. Catherine, the daughter of arguably the most powerful couple in Europe, bred and raised to be a pawn on the chessboard of European diplomatic and military relations, and Anne, a child of a wealthy courtier who would be catapulted to a status beyond her ambitious father's wildest dreams. There's also a heavy focus on the religious differences that would come to define their legacies. Catherine's staunch, never-wavering Catholicism, and Anne's near heretical belief in royal supremacy over the Church. The exhibition also touches on their similarities. Both suffered multiple miscarriages and/or stillbirths, with only a single surviving daughter each, both of whom would eventually inherit the throne in their own rights. And of course, both Catherine and Anne would each experience the unenviable consequences of a fall from Henry's favor. My skepticism on the depiction of Catherine of Aragon's wax figure also extends to the one of Anne Boleyn. It's worth mentioning here that all surviving portraits of Anne were painted after her death. Those painted during her lifetime were ordered by Henry to be destroyed. The oldest depiction we have of her was actually created 14 years after her death. However, what is truly fascinating about this figure of Anne is that she is positioned next to an illuminated and gilded china cabinet that is thought to have originally been a priest hole, a secret hiding space built into the homes of wealthy Catholics at a time when they were being persecuted by law. In the 17th century, Hever Castle came into the hands of the Waldgrave family, who installed the priest hole at a time where saying the Catholic Mass was illegal. They also added some beautiful carvings to this room, including the woodwork above this fireplace, which bears the initials of Henry Waldgrave. From here, we are going to make our way to the upper floor of the castle to visit what is thought to have been Anne Boleyn's childhood bedroom, which she may have shared with her sister, Mary. It is known that Anne did spend her childhood in the castle, although she was born at Blickling Hall in Norfolk in either 1501 or 1507, and the topic of that debate could be an entire video in its own right. When Henry began to pursue Anne in earnest, she would often retreat here to Hever Castle as part of her efforts to avoid becoming his mistress, and it was here, during the Christmas festivities of 1526, that she accepted the king's proposal of marriage, changing the course of English history forever, and this little space was her room. It's a lot smaller than you might have been expecting, although today it's filled with multiple displays which add to that feeling. In fact, there are twin portraits of the girls here on their former bedroom wall. The one on the right is a 17th century copy of a lost original thought to depict Mary Boleyn. The one on the left is thought by some to depict Anne, based on an earlier Hans Holbein work. There's another portrait of Anne here, hanging on the opposite wall, which bears some similarities. But remember what I said. There are no certifiable, surviving contemporary portraits of Anne Boleyn. There are multiple images purported or believed to be of her, which I'm showing you here, some of which look quite alike, and some of which don't. A contemporary description of Anne was given by the Venetian ambassador, who I'm absolutely sure was incredibly handsome, who described her as, quote, "not one of the handsomest women in the world. She is of middling stature, with a swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, bosom not much raised, and her eyes, which are black and beautiful." The only authentic depiction of the doomed queen we have is this coin, which was struck in 1534. Although some believe the figure displayed in this ring that belonged to Queen Elizabeth I could be a depiction of Anne, which I like to believe, although for fairness' sake, I have to point out that some historians also believe it to be Elizabeth's last stepmother, Catherine Parr. There's a lovely view out the window here, and I also want to point out the unique half-domed ceiling, which is original to the 15th century. Now, although this is referred to as Anne Boleyn's bedroom, it is far more likely that she and her siblings slept in what was once called the Great Chamber, where I'll take you next. But first, above the fireplace are two sketches by Holbein. One is titled Ormond, and is thought to depict Thomas Boleyn, and the other of an unknown man, perhaps Anne's brother, George, who would face his own execution 2 days before his sister. In between the sketches is a marriage plaque commemorating 2 marriages, that on the left of Thomas Boleyn to Lady Elizabeth Howard, and that on the right of their daughter Anne and King Henry VIII. And not even close to an original artifact, but still interesting, at least to me, is this costume in the corner, which was worn by Richard Burton during his portrayal of Henry VIII in the 1969 film Anne of a Thousand Days, large parts of which were actually filmed right here in Hever Castle. The tapestry in this next room illustrates the marriage of Henry VIII's sister, Princess Mary, to King Louis XII of France in 1512. It is known that Anne Boleyn and her sister Mary were present at the wedding, and it could be that they are represented in this tapestry, although which figures might be based on them is not clear. What do you think? But the real highlight of this room are two original 16th century illuminated prayer books known as Books of Hours. This one belonged to Anne Boleyn. These sorts of books were very popular in England from the 13th century until the Reformation. The name Book of Hours comes from the short services to the Virgin Mary, which were read at 8 fixed hours throughout the day. Both of these were produced in Germany, and it's likely that they came from the same printing that were commissioned as gifts for selected members of the court in the 1520s. This one was Catherine of Aragon's. And as different as the two queens were, so were their prayer books. Anne's book is gilded with golden page borders and showcases colored red and blue embellishments around the images printed inside. The images are also all surrounded by a detailed oval border. None of these details are present in the copy that belonged to Catherine. You can see them side by side in the next image. This comes as no surprise, given that Anne Boleyn loved highly decorated books, and Hever Castle curators point out that this is also a nod to Anne's sky-high ambitions. Owning a book more elaborately decorated than the Queen's points firmly to Anne's belief that her desired position as Henry's wife was easily within her reach. Now, let's return to Anne's. Within this book is an inscription written by Anne's own hand, dated to 1529. It reads, "Remember me when you do pray, that hope doth lead from day to day. Anne Boleyn." It's believed that this book was the very one she took with her on her final journey to the Tower of London, and that she was holding it mere minutes before her execution. It is a rare thing for this book to survive, particularly because Henry ordered the destruction of any trace of Anne after her death. But a series of hidden inscriptions inside this Book of Hours, recently uncovered by historian Kate McCaffrey, indicates that a network of trusted female confidants preserved this book in secret, a treasonous act after the downfall of the Boleyn family, and a small display of defiance brought to light nearly 500 years later. In the time of the Boleyn family, this was part of what was known as the Great Chamber. Originally featuring a much larger, vaulted ceiling, this was used as a bedchamber for the Astors, but was the main living room in the 16th century, and where Anne of Cleves would have spent most of her time. In both her time and that of the Boleyns, it would have been the center of the household, used for family gatherings, privately entertaining guests, for writing and household admin, and sometimes for family meals. We next make our way into the staircase gallery. This is the smallest of the two galleries at Hever Castle. It was built in the 16th century to provide access between the two wings of the house and the newer, larger gallery upstairs, which we will visit in a bit. It's believed to be one of the earliest galleries built in England, and you may remember others I mentioned in my Hampton Court Palace video. Now, building this would have cost a fair bit of money. All the glass for these windows would have been very expensive. In fact, glass was so expensive that in Tudor times it was normal for glass windows to be removed when the residing family was away. That way, it could be carefully packed and preserved, ready to be reinstalled at their return. which was quite unfortunate for the staff left behind in the houses during the winter months. The gallery is named the Staircase Gallery, as it once held the staircase that led from the front door to the upper chambers, which was changed in the time of the Astors. Today, it is filled with a few items of interest. Firstly, a wax figure of King Henry VIII with a portrait of his son behind him, and this portrait of his daughter Elizabeth. This painting, which to me is the stereotypical Queen Elizabeth, dates from 1580 and was painted by John Betts the Younger. Next to it is another portrait, painted in the year of her accession when she was 25 years old. I love the detail on her clothing. Also, I think she looks a bit like her father here, which was likely a deliberate choice. Between the portraits is a collection of baby clothes dating from the 17th and 18th century, including linen ties and gloves, along with a silk cap, all in white, which seems like a bold choice for a toddler, but was partially used because it would have been easy to bleach. And at the end of the gallery is a portrait of King James I, who came to the throne after the death of Elizabeth I, and his mother, Elizabeth's cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was executed on Elizabeth's orders. For more information on them, make sure to check out my Edinburgh Castle video. This hallway takes us to what used to be called the Waldgrave Room. It previously held an elaborately carved French oak and walnut four-poster bed dating from the 1480s. But the day that I visited, there were some beautiful costumes from the Becoming Elizabeth miniseries that aired on Starz and Channel 4 in 2022. This was worn by the actress playing Catherine Parr. Look at these fabulous sleeves. I wish I could dress like this. Anybody else? Next is a costume for Edward VI, and then Mary and Elizabeth in green. Mary's black gown has beautiful gold detailing. These are lovely, but I wish we were looking at the real thing rather than costumes. And you can see Anne Boleyn's famous necklace on Elizabeth's costume, an item of jewelry that, in reality, has been lost to time. At the time of Anne Boleyn, this room was part of the servants' dormitory, but later became a primary bedroom. When Anne of Cleves died in 1557, Hever Castle reverted to the crown and came into the control of Queen Mary I. Sir Edward Waldgrave, a member of her council, was tasked with selling the crown land, and, in a move that I somewhat admire, he quickly assigned Hever Castle to himself. Hever would remain in the control of the Waldgrave family for the next 158 years, the longest period of ownership in the castle's history. With the accession of Elizabeth I to the throne, Catholicism was quickly outlawed, prompting the Waldgrave family to install not only the priest holes that I showed you earlier, but this beautiful hidden chapel. Here, you will find a large Italian rock crystal cross dating from around 1700, sitting atop carved scenes from the Book of Genesis, and above both is a 19th century painting of the Virgin Mary. In a case opposite all the costumes sits a Jacobite rhyming blade sword. This is one of only 5 known surviving swords that were created in support of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, also detailed in my Edinburgh Castle video, which I'll stop mentioning now. It's hard to see the inscription, but it reads, "With this good sword thy cause I will maintain, and for thy sake, O James, will break each vein." The sword likely belonged to Henry Waldgrave, a great-great-grandson of Sir Edward, who married the illegitimate daughter of King James II, Henrietta Fitz-James. Incidentally, Henry was the 7th great-grandfather of the late Princess Diana. Next, we are going to make our way into what's known as the King Henry VIII bedchamber. To be clear, Although this is called the Henry VIII bedchamber, there is no solid evidence that this is the room he stayed in while he visited Hever Castle. In truth, there is also no solid evidence that Henry even spent the night in this castle. Given the large size of his household and the relatively small size of the building, it may very well be that he slept in nearby Penhurst Palace instead. More to the point, if Henry had spent the night here, he would most likely have been given the Great Chamber, the room where I showed you the books of hours. In actuality, this room's location over the original kitchens suggests it may have really been part of the servants' quarters. The room is dominated by this beautiful four-poster bed, which actually dates from around the 1540s. It's known as a tester bed and was made to celebrate the marriage of a Tudor-era couple. Who they were exactly is not known, but we do know their initials were R and A, as their initials can clearly be seen carved into some of the woodwork. The carving in the headboard features a royal coat of arms, as well as the initials E and R, but it's unclear if this stands for Edward Rex or Elizabeth Regina. Regardless, this bed is a fine example of the sort of Tudor-era bed King Henry would have been familiar with. And a bed of this size, with fine materials, could literally cost as much as a small farm in the 16th century. The ceiling in this room is the oldest in the castle, dating from 1462, and the majority of the wooden paneling here dates from 1565. The exception to this are the panels above the fireplace that you can see here. These were carved centuries later and feature an image of Henry VIII, with Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves on either side of him. And just beside the fireplace is a household item that used to be incredibly popular, but no longer really exists, an 18th century warming pan. These pans were filled with hot embers and tucked into the upper layers of bedding of the wealthy to keep the bed warm before the occupants came to sleep. Warming pans became a hot topic of conversation in England in the 17th century, when it was alleged that the newborn son of King James II and his second wife, Mary of Modena, was actually stillborn, and a changeling baby of unclear birth was smuggled into the Queen's bed in a warming pan as part of a plot to continue Catholic rule in the country. The illuminated costume in the room comes from the same miniseries I mentioned previously, but it's actually modeled on the outfit Queen Elizabeth I was depicted as wearing in her coronation portrait, which I think is a lovely touch. And there's a replica crown, orb, and scepter right next to it. We are now making our way upstairs to the Long Gallery. Many great houses in the 16th and 17th centuries featured what were known as long galleries, a long, high-ceilinged room on the upper floor of a castle or manor. These rooms would be used to display art and treasures, or to entertain guests. They could even be used as an exercise space, utilized by the inhabiting family when the weather was too poor for walks outside. I don't know about you, but this looks a lot nicer than my gym. At more than 98 feet, or 30 meters long, the Long Gallery runs the entire length of the castle, which actually goes to show that this isn't as large a place as some might imagine. The paneling is Elizabethan, and the ceiling is an accurate 16th century style reproduction. It was created on the orders of William Waldorf Astor and painted in what is thought to be the original off-white color. The detail is remarkable, and its varying patterns of foliage, from which drops a number of chandeliers, which are direct copies of those on display at Hampton Court Palace. Astor's dedication to having this ceiling made is remarkable. He had the entire thing commissioned and created in London and brought to the Kentish countryside by a personally chartered steam train. He then ordered the extension of the railway tracks from the local station to the Hever estate to get the ceiling as close as possible to its final destination. These days, the exhibition up here is largely a series of portraits depicting the figures that were involved in the Wars of the Roses, the series of civil wars over control of the English throne from 1455 to 1487, fought largely by warring branches of the House of Plantagenet. The Wars of the Roses name was first used in the 19th century and comes from the fact that the two warring houses, that of Lancaster and York, each used roses on their heraldic badges, red for Lancaster and white for York. When Henry VII, a Lancaster claimant to the throne, married Princess Elizabeth of York, they combined the emblems to create the Tudor rose. The reason I mention all this is because the portraits here are framed by red and white stripes of color to designate which part of the family the depicted figure belonged to, which I think is a lovely little touch. Here is Elizabeth Woodville and her husband, King Edward IV, grandparents to Henry VIII. Further along is Henry VI, then his father Henry V, and his father, Henry IV. With 18 original portraits on display, historian and personal hero Dr. David Starkey is quoted as saying that this Hever Castle is home to, quote, one of the best collections of Tudor portraits after the National Gallery. And here are the Tudors: Margaret Beaufort and her son, King Henry VII. Then Henry's wife, Elizabeth of York, parents to Henry VIII. And here is Prince Arthur, the elder brother of King Henry VIII. This is the only portrait of Arthur that was painted in his short lifetime. He died at the age of 15 at Ludlow Castle, shortly after his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. His passing would set into motion Henry's path to the throne, his first marriage to his brother's widow, and the court case that would change the history of Europe, which largely revolved around whether Arthur and Catherine had ever actually successfully consummated their marriage. The morning after their wedding, Prince Arthur is said to have walked out of his bedchamber, claiming he was thirsty, quote, "for I have been in the midst of Spain last night." Despite his boasts, Catherine maintained till her dying day that she was a virgin when she married King Henry, a fact he would either believe or not, depending on how it suited him at the time. And here is Henry, with the red and white symbolic colors, and beside him, Catherine of Aragon. Next comes their daughter, Queen Mary I. And then Anne Boleyn, in what's known as the Hever Rose portrait, one of the best-known assumed depictions of her. It's worth noting that the portraits and the curtains hanging beside them are largely accurate to how this room may have looked in the 16th century. It is known that Anne of Cleves hung a series of Tudor portraits in her home to showcase her allegiance to the crown. And wealthy Tudors would have kept curtains on either side of their finest portraits so that they could be drawn over the canvas to protect the works of art from sunlight and damage. This means we may very well be looking at a room that Anne herself would have recognized. And here is a lovely painting I found that showcases how this gallery would have looked in the 17th century. Also on display in the room is a copy of the signed petition that was sent by members of the House of Lords to Pope Clement VII. It dates from July 1530 and is essentially a well-worded plea for an annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The letter threatens that if the Pope does not agree, the signees will be forced to, quote, attain this end by other means. It's interesting to wonder if Clement could have had any idea just what lengths Henry was willing to go to. There are a number of signatures at the bottom, but one of the clearest is that of George Rochford, Anne Boleyn's brother. But for me, the highlight of this room is a seemingly innocuous wooden panel which bears the initials of Anne of Cleves. This particular panel dates from around 1544 and was put up for auction by a private seller in 2017. It was purchased by the Guthrie family, the current owners of Hever Castle, and installed here. The panel is known to have come from a former home of Anne's. We just don't know which one. And there is a chance, of course, that it originated here at Hever Castle so many centuries ago. It appears that the design on the panel was later used as inspiration for Anne's tomb in Westminster Abbey. Original items from Tudor interiors tend to be few and far between, so for this small wooden panel to survive is truly something special. And just behind me is some lovely stained glass that depicts the coat of arms of the various people and families who have laid claim to Hever Castle. Here, you can see both Annes clearly represented. And through these windows is a lovely view onto the moat. Tradition states that it was within this alcove, where I'm standing, that Henry VIII held court when he visited Hever Castle. You can just imagine people in their finest clothing processing down the gallery, coming closer and closer to the most important man in the country. Knowing me, I'd trip and fall somewhere along the way. The next part of the castle is the most recent, having been rebuilt after a terrible storm in 1968, which saw 5 inches of rain fall in just under 16 hours. 100 rooms within Hever Castle and the surrounding estate were flooded, and the contents of the castle's ground floor were completely destroyed. Known as the Astor Suite corridor, this contains 3 small bedrooms that belonged to the 3 daughters of Gavin Astor, the great-granddaughters of William Waldorf Astor, Bridget, Elizabeth, and Sarah. They were each allowed to choose their own decor, and this little wing of the castle became known as, quote, the dog kennels, affectionately, or so they say. I find the contrast of these rooms with the rest of the castle to be particularly striking, and I do love this little built-in bed here. But this is a brief interlude of modernity, as we now travel back to the past and head into the medieval gatehouse, one of the oldest surviving parts of the castle. This is the gatehouse, directly above the castle's entrance, which would have, in medieval times, been known as the council chamber. The castle owners in the 13th century would have slept, eaten, and entertained within this space. Here, you can see the lifting mechanism for a defensive portcullis below, with the counterweights at the bottom of the chains. Today, the gatehouse holds a number of unsettling artifacts, but also features a garderobe. If you've seen my other videos, you know these are always a highlight. Now this would have emptied directly into the moat below us. In medieval times, guests would leave their coats or cloaks right next to the garderobe, or toilet, as we would call it, as it was believed the associated odors would protect clothing from moths and fleas. These days, this chamber is more like a small armory, which holds a collection of historic swords and armor, as well as some disturbing instruments of both execution and torture. I haven't the heart to get into all the gory details here, so I have chosen a few items of note to highlight. Firstly, is this man-trap, which is not the way I find my husband's, but rather a snare for catching trespassers and poachers. They were made illegal to use outdoors here in 1827, but not completely banned until 1861. Next is a charming collection of German beheading swords, all dating from the 16th and 17th centuries. These swords would have rounded tips, as the extended width added weight to the blade, increasing the swing momentum to enable a successful decapitation with a single stroke. And here, a number of 18th century torture collars. Note the spikes on the inside of the one on the left. From the gatehouse, we take our leave of the interiors of the castle. We exit down a set of stairs built in a defensive spiral. Some of the steps in this staircase are of uneven heights, which is thought to have been a deliberate decision rather than poor construction. The idea may have been that castle residents would know where the uneven steps were located, whereas an attacker might not. Here is the gatehouse we were just in, and the door from which we exited is here. As I pan around the courtyard, you can see the different stages of construction here at Hever. The Tudor framing here, and the long gallery where we were walking earlier, and the medieval stonework as we exit. Ahead of us again is the oldest operating portcullis in the country, whose counterweights we just saw. You may also notice the murder holes above us. These were a common medieval defense mechanism, enabling castle defenders to drop rocks, hot embers, boiling oil, liquid fat, or even urine, if one was looking to save some money, onto would-be attackers. We leave the castle now, back over the moat, which today is filled with some beautiful koi fish. We'll also take a last look at the frontage of the building. The vines you see crawling up the stone are Boston ivy, native to Eastern Asia. Any Chicago Cubs fans may know it as the type used on the brick outfield at Wrigley Field. But finding plants here that originate from the other side of the globe is not unusual, as Hever Castle is home to a magnificent series of gardens commissioned by William Waldorf Astor, spanning around 125 acres. The gardens at Hever Castle are simply stunning and worth visiting in their own right. I went in a winter month, so the blooms were not as vibrant as they can be, but the grounds were still splendid and charming. The gardens as they exist today were laid out by Joseph Cheel and Son between 1904 and 1908. However, despite the initial planting over 100 years ago, the garden has only recently begun to reach maturity. However, many of the trees that stand on the estate today were planted much more recently. The Great Storm of 1987, which saw hurricane-force winds batter the United Kingdom, felled over 1,000 of the original trees. The majority of trees planted to replace those lost in the storm were replanted and make up much of a fair percentage of the trees visible today. Some highlights of the Hever Castle garden include this, the Italian garden. These were laid out specifically to display William Waldorf Astor's collection of Italian sculpture. The wall along the side here is known as the Pompeian Wall. In the springtime, this area flourishes with kiwi fruit, figs, olives, and pomegranates. And I do feel the need to point out that the pomegranate was the heraldic symbol of Catherine of Aragon. I wonder if anybody thought of that at the time they were being planted here. Just ahead of us, there's also a beautiful man-made lake. It took 800 men 2 years to dig out and create the 38-acre water feature you see here. And it's flanked by a stone loggia into which is built a fountain, inspired by the famous Trevi Fountain in Rome. It was such a grey day when I visited, but I still think the surrounds are stunning. The pergola I'm walking under here traipses along the rose garden, which is home to over 5,000 roses. In fact, the gardens at Hever feature over 20,000 spring bulbs, all of which blossom every year. There's also the charming Tudor garden, largely inaccessible to the public, which is edged in 100 meters of herbaceous border in Gertrude Jekyll style. You can see it here, just between where I'm standing and the castle. That Tudor garden is also host to some excellent topiary, a chess set formed of golden yew. The shape of the chess pieces are based on those that were in use at the court of King Henry VIII. In front of the chess set stands an 18th century sundial, designed to also measure the altitude of the sun, moon, and stars. There's also a large hedge maze, which you can see in this aerial view. It was open the day I visited, but it took me far too long to find my way through, so forgive me for not including all of that footage. And just a stone's throw from the castle is a lovely little cemetery that was created by the Astor family for their dearly departed dogs. The stones are quite worn and hard to read, but I could make out a few. A Cavalier King Charles Spaniel listed as friend to Bridget, who died in the 1950s. Then there's Kipps and James, who died on the 25th of July, 1939. Jeff, who died on the 13th of December, 1936. And Eula, Katie, another King Charles Spaniel, and Jones. There's also Jumbo and Jeeps. There's a Nell, too. I think this is quite sweet, but one of my friends said she thought it was creepy. What do you think? Before I take my leave, I want to acknowledge that I am aware of some people who have expressed disappointment that so little of the furnishings, decor, and even entire rooms that Anne Boleyn herself would have used during her time spent at Hever Castle survive. To those who feel the same, I have two things to say. Firstly, is that the curatorial team at Hever Castle are unmatched and are bringing as much of Anne's history to life within the castle as is possible. In fact, some of the rooms I've shown you today will be part of a new exhibition, which showcases more of Hever Castle from the Tudor period. Secondly, if it had not been for the efforts of the Astor family, we may very well have been left with nothing here at all. Even by the time of Anne of Cleves in the 1550s, Hever Castle was in a state of disrepair. A letter Anne wrote to Queen Mary in 1554 survives in the National Archives, and at the bottom of it is Anne's signature, after which she wrote, quote, "From my poor house of Hever." And as we look out over the Astor wing along the moat, and the magnificent beauty of this incredible building, I think we can all agree that there is very little which is poor about Hever Castle today. Thank you, as always, for joining me. You'll find links to my other castle and palace videos in the description below. But for now, I will say goodbye to the Astors, Anne of Cleves, Anne Boleyn, and you, as I return us back to the 21st century. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to my new channel, Crown and Kingdom. You'll find the link in the description below. There, I'll be delivering more detailed virtual tours, along with sharing a tongue-in-cheek look at the best and worst of British history, stories, and people. Until next time, this is Margot Moore, wishing you goodbye and good times.